It all started with a letter. I never thought a simple envelope could stir up so much anger in me. But there it was, tucked inside my mailbox one ordinary Tuesday morning, an official-looking letter from the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as they like to call themselves. The kind of letter you never want to receive. I hadn't even opened it yet when I saw the name on the sender's address. The HOA's insignia, the same group that had been trying to control every little detail of our neighborhood for years. The same group that decided what color your house could be, what kind of lawn ornaments you could have, how tall your grass could grow, and even how many days you could leave your trash bins out after pickup. I had always found their obsession with conformity a little suffocating, but I tried to live quietly, follow the rules, and avoid conflict. After all, I was just one person in a sea of suburban mediocrity. But this letter felt different. I tore it open with a mix of dread and curiosity. Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your home does not meet the aesthetic guidelines established for our community. Specifically, we have noticed that the exterior color of your house does not conform to the neighborhood standards, and as such, we request that you repaint your house using the official beige suburbia palette, as outlined in our community guidelines. Please be advised that failure to comply within the next 30 days will result in a fine and further action from the HOA board. Kind regards, the Homeowners Association. I stared at the letter for a few moments, trying to process what I had just read. Beige suburbia. The mere thought of it made my blood boil. Who decided that beige was the only color allowed in a neighborhood? Who gave them the power to dictate what we could and couldn't do with our own homes? I had lived in this house for 5 years. When I first bought it, I'd carefully selected a warm, earthy tone that felt welcoming, something with a little character. It wasn't too loud or obnoxious, just a simple color that blended with the surroundings. But apparently, it wasn't enough. Apparently, it didn't fit their idea of what was acceptable in our so-called community. I walked to the window and looked at my house from the outside. It didn't look out of place. It was a modest, 2-story home with a small front yard and a single tree in the corner. The neighbors had their cookie-cutter homes, and I didn't mind that. We all had our little spaces in this suburban bubble. But now it felt like the HOA was encroaching on what little space I had left to be me. I could already feel the pressure building in my chest. The worst part, this wasn't the first time the HOA had been on my case. Every few months it was something new. Whether it was a complaint about my lawn not being manicured enough or a suggestion to trim my hedges a certain way. They had sent letters before, but nothing had ever felt as invasive as this. Now they were telling me how to paint my house. How was that even legal? I paced the living room, trying to calm down. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I should just paint the house beige and get it over with. After all, what harm would it do? I could just go with the flow, blend in, and move on. It would save me the trouble of dealing with any more complaints. But then I thought about it. I thought about how the HOA had been chipping away at people's individuality for years. I thought about how many times I had seen neighbors give in to the pressure, doing whatever the HOA told them just to avoid conflict. It was like a game, a quiet little war of conformity. No more. I made a decision then and there. I wasn't going to let them dictate my life. They wanted beige. Well, they were about to get more than they bargained for. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I would make a statement. In this neighborhood, This neighborhood was going to hear me loud and clear. I grabbed a piece of paper and scribbled down my plan. It was crazy, it was bold, and it might just work. One thing was for sure, the HOA would never forget me. The more I thought about the HOA's demand, the more infuriating it became. They weren't just asking me to paint my house beige, they were asking me to erase a part of my identity, and that wasn't something I was willing to do. I needed to take a stand, to make them see that people weren't just mindless drones who followed their rules without question. I couldn't do this alone. I had to involve my neighbors. Surely I wasn't the only one who felt stifled by the HOA's suffocating grip. I started by talking to my immediate neighbor, Karen. She was a kind, older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. Her house was small, but always impeccably maintained, and though she had always kept to herself, I knew she wasn't exactly a fan of the HOA's constant meddling. When I mentioned the letter, she raised an eyebrow. Beige, huh? That's new, she said with a chuckle. You should see what they did to my friend across the street. Made her rip down her garden gnomes because they didn't match the community aesthetic. It's ridiculous. I told her about my plan, how I wasn't just going to repaint my house beige, how I wanted to do something bigger, something that would make a statement. At first, Karen was hesitant. I don't know, dear, she said, wringing her hands. The HOA can be persistent. They'll come after you. I don't care, I replied. I'm done letting them push me around. If we all stand together, they won't have the power to stop us. Karen thought about it for a moment before nodding. Well, I suppose if you're going to go down that road, I might as well join you. What's the worst that could happen? At least I won't have to look at beige houses anymore. And just like that, the rebellion began. The next day, I went door to door to speak with my other neighbors. Some were initially skeptical, not wanting to risk fines or penalties, but most of them were fed up with the HOA's overreach. I found out that I wasn't the only one who had received a letter. A few others had also been told to repaint their houses in the same dull beige, and they weren't happy about it either. Why beige? Asked Alex, a young artist who lived a few houses down. That color is the absolute definition of bland. Why not something unique? That was the exact question I had been asking myself. Why beige? Why couldn't we, as homeowners, have the freedom to choose how our houses looked? Before long, the idea took off like wildfire. More and more neighbors joined the cause. The plan wasn't just to paint our houses bold colors. It was to completely transform our neighborhood into something new, something that celebrated individuality instead of stifling it. We started brainstorming what colors we would paint our homes. Karen, who had always been fond of lilacs, wanted her house to be a soft lavender. Alex, the artist, chose a vibrant turquoise. Someone else proposed a deep maroon. Another wanted a striking yellow. We even joked about turning our little street into a rainbow. The excitement was contagious. Each person I spoke to was more eager than the last. Soon, we were all gathered at Karen's house, with a massive stack of paint swatches, debating which shades would look best on each house. We planned a neighborhood-wide makeover, and no one was backing down. But as we got more and more excited, we started to realize the implications of what we were doing. We weren't just painting our houses, we were taking a stand against the HOA. We were publicly defying their authority, and that came with consequences. But what could they really do? Fine us? Sue us? Maybe. But the way I saw it, we had one thing the HOA didn't: unity. And that made all the difference. I say we do it all at once, said Alex, leaning forward, eyes alight with excitement. A flash makeover. We do it on a weekend. Get as many people involved as we can. No one will see it coming. The plan was set. We would all transform our homes in a single weekend, showing the HOA and the whole neighborhood that we weren't going to follow their rules anymore. It was time for change. The following Saturday, we gathered our supplies: paint, brushes, rollers, and everything else we needed to give our homes a fresh coat of rebellion. As the sun rose that morning, we were ready to take on the HOA, one brush stroke at a time. But as the day wore on and the first brush hit the wall of my house, I realized this wasn't just about paint anymore. It wasn't just about a house. This was about reclaiming our freedom, about standing up to an authority that thought it could control every little detail of our lives. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The day we started painting was nothing short of chaotic and thrilling. What had started as a small act of defiance in my living room had now exploded into a full-blown neighborhood movement. We were all united in our shared goal to reclaim our homes and our freedom from the suffocating grip of the HOA. As I stood there, brush in hand, looking at the first strokes of paint on my house, it felt surreal. The bright color was like a beacon, cutting through the monotony that the HOA had forced upon us. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol, a statement. Around me, the neighborhood was coming alive. Karen's lavender house gleamed in the morning light, while Alex's turquoise walls contrasted sharply with the surrounding greenery. The entire street was transforming, one house at a time. It was like the world had been dipped in color, vivid, bold, unapologetic, and I couldn't help but smile. But the transformation wasn't just about color. It was about reclaiming control, about telling the HOA that we were not just a neighborhood. We were individuals, each with our own personalities, and we didn't have to follow their boring, beige rules to fit in. The work didn't stop for the whole weekend. We painted from sunup to sundown, taking breaks only when necessary. Neighbors came and went, bringing snacks, drinks, and extra paint supplies. It wasn't just a home improvement project. It was a community event. The atmosphere was electric with excitement and camaraderie. We had become a team, a collective of rebels united by a common cause. As the hours passed, the neighborhood began to look like something out of a dream. The rows of beige houses were replaced with vibrant, energetic colors. People stopped their cars to stare as they drove by, some even taking pictures. It felt like we were putting our town on the map, not as a dull suburban street, but as a bold, artistic community that refused to be silenced. By Sunday evening, most of the houses were done. The neighborhood had gone from bland to beautiful in less than 2 days. It was something I never could have imagined, but now that it was done, I couldn't picture it any other way. Our homes had become works of art, each with its own personality, each telling a different story. But just as we finished the last brushstrokes, something unexpected happened. A black SUV rolled up to the end of our street, and a man in a suit stepped out. It didn't take long to recognize him, the president of the HOA. He stood there, arms crossed, looking over the neighborhood with a mix of confusion and irritation. His eyes scanned the freshly painted houses, and I could see the anger building in his expression. "Is this some kind of joke?" he called out, his voice laced with disbelief. Karen, who had been painting her front porch, wiped her hands on a rag and stepped forward. "I think it's a statement," she said, smiling as she crossed her arms. The man's eyes narrowed, "You're all in violation of HOA rules," he said, his voice sharp. "All of these homes need to be repainted, or you'll face fines. You can't just go around changing the look of the neighborhood without approval." I stepped forward then, my heart pounding in my chest. "And why not?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rising tension. "Why does everything have to look the same? Why do we all have to blend in?" "This is a community," he replied, his tone condescending. "We have guidelines to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. You can't just throw that away because of a personal vendetta." I shook my head. "It's not a vendetta. It's about having a choice, about not being told what we can and can't do with our homes. We're tired of being controlled." He scoffed, clearly not expecting this kind of response. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, turning to leave. "I'll be back to deal with this." And with that, he got back into his SUV and drove off, leaving us standing there, unsure of what would come next. But we weren't backing down. That night, as I sat on my front porch, looking at the vibrant colors around me, I felt a sense of pride. Our neighborhood had changed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. We had shown that we could come together, defy the odds, and make our voices heard. But as I watched the sun set on our colorful neighborhood, I realized that the battle wasn't over. The HOA wouldn't let this go so easily. They would come after us, but we were ready. And this time, we had more than just paint on our side. We had a community, and we weren't afraid to fight for what we believed in. The next few days were filled with a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. As I walked down the street, I couldn't help but smile. Our neighborhood had become a statement, a bright, bold, defiant statement. But I knew the HOA wouldn't take this lying down. The man in the suit had made it clear that he wouldn't just let us get away with it. And sure enough, the following Thursday afternoon, another letter arrived. "Dear residents, we are writing to inform you that the recent changes to the exterior colors of your homes are in direct violation of the HOA's community standards. As previously stated, homes must adhere to the beige suburbia color palette. Failure to comply with the HOA guidelines will result in significant fines and further legal action. We strongly advise you to return your homes to their approved colors by the end of next week, or face legal consequences. Sincerely, the Homeowners Association." I read the letter twice, trying to hold in my frustration. Legal action. They were serious now. I immediately texted Karen, Alex, and the others, organizing a neighborhood meeting for that evening. As much as I wanted to ignore the letter, I knew we couldn't afford to just sit back and hope it would go away. The HOA had power, and they weren't afraid to use it. By sunset, we had gathered in Karen's living room. The tension was palpable. Everyone was worried, unsure of what to do next. The HOA was threatening us with fines and legal battles, and we had no idea what we were up against. Karen was the first to speak up. "They can't really make us paint our houses back to beige, can they? This is ridiculous. We've already put so much time and effort into this transformation." "I'm not going back to beige. I can't." "I agree," Alex chimed in, leaning forward. "We have the right to express ourselves however we want, right? We're not breaking any laws by painting our houses. This isn't just about the paint. It's about our freedom." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement, but the questions lingered. What could we do? Could we really stand up to the HOA, or would they destroy everything we had worked for? I stood up, pacing the room, trying to come up with a plan. We can't just let them bully us into submission. If we give in now, what happens next? They'll keep finding new ways to control us. First, it's the paint. Then who knows? I looked around at the faces of my neighbors. Their eyes were filled with the same uncertainty that I felt. But I knew one thing. We couldn't back down. Not now. Maybe it's time to take this to the next level, I said, my voice firm. We can't just comply and repaint everything. We need to show them we won't be intimidated. If they want to fight, then we'll fight. How? Karen asked, her voice small but determined. They have all the power. They can fine us, sue us, whatever they want. I nodded. They have power, sure, but we have something they don't have. People. We've got a whole neighborhood behind us. And the longer they try to fight us, the more people will take notice. We're not just a bunch of homeowners. They're messing with the community now. And when people start talking, when people start getting upset about the way they're treating us, the HOA won't be able to ignore us anymore. Alex raised an eyebrow. So, what are you suggesting? We go public, I said, with growing conviction. We tell our story. We contact the media, local news, social media, whatever it takes to get the word out. We make it clear that this is about more than just paint. It's about control, it's about freedom, and it's about standing up for what's right. If the HOA thinks they can just trample over us, they've got another thing coming. There was a moment of silence as everyone processed what I had said. Then, one by one, they started nodding in agreement. Let's do it, Karen said. Let's take this to the world. The plan was set. We would reach out to local news outlets, social media platforms, and even blogs. We would make sure that people knew what was happening here, how a group of neighbors had decided to take a stand against an authoritarian HOA. We would show the world how something as simple as a coat of paint had turned into a fight for freedom. It wasn't going to be easy, we knew that, but we were ready for whatever the HOA threw our way. The next morning, we all got to work. I contacted a local reporter who had written about community issues in the past. I wasn't sure if they would take the story seriously, but I had to try. Meanwhile, Alex started creating a social media campaign with the hashtag #ColorOurHomes, encouraging other homeowners who had been forced to comply with HOA rules to share their stories. And just like that, the movement gained momentum. People started posting photos of their houses, their struggles with the HOA, and the outrageous rules they had been forced to follow. It was like a spark had ignited, and before we knew it, our small act of defiance was reaching people across the country. The HOA had no idea what they were up against. The following week was a whirlwind. The story we had shared with the local media quickly gained traction, sparking a conversation that spread far beyond our small neighborhood. So the hashtag #ColorOurHomes started trending locally, and before we knew it, national news outlets were calling for interviews. The HOA had underestimated us. They thought a simple letter would be enough to force us into submission, but instead, it had lit a fire under us. People across the country, homeowners, renters, even renters in buildings governed by similar associations, started speaking out. It wasn't just about paint anymore. It was about the power dynamics between homeowners and HOAs, about the limits of authority and control, and about how far they could push people before they fought back. A few days after the initial report went viral, I was sitting on my front porch, enjoying the warm evening air, when my phone rang. It was the local news station. They wanted an interview. Hello, I answered, my voice shaky with both excitement and nerves. Hi, is this the person behind the #ColorOurHomes movement? A reporter asked. Yes, that's me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We'd like to schedule an interview, the reporter said. we've been getting an overwhelming amount of feedback from the community. People want to know more about why you and your neighbors are fighting back against the HOA's demands. How do you feel about sharing your story? My heart raced. Of course, I'll do it. Thank you for the opportunity. We set up a time for the interview, and soon the news crew arrived at my house. The cameras rolled, the lights were bright, and the crew set up. The interview was nerve-wracking, but I knew it was an opportunity to reach even more people. When the camera started recording, I took a deep breath and began speaking. I'm just a homeowner like anyone else, I said, looking directly into the camera. I've spent years building a life here. I've painted my house the colors I love, and for the first time, I was told that wasn't allowed. The HOA demanded I repaint my house beige. No explanation, no flexibility, just a command. And that wasn't something I could accept. It wasn't just about the paint. It was about my right to make decisions about my own home. As I spoke, I saw the crew nodding, the reporter taking notes, and I felt more confident. My voice wavered less, and my passion began to show. And I'm not the only one, I continued. There are dozens of families on this street, families who have been told to change the way they live, change the way they express themselves, all for the sake of an outdated, restrictive set of rules that don't even make sense anymore. People shouldn't have to hide their personalities behind beige walls just to fit in. This is our home, our community, and if we don't fight back now, what's next? The reporter smiled as the camera cut. That's powerful stuff, she said. We'll definitely get that out to our viewers. And just like that, our story went viral. The phone calls kept coming. More media outlets, more people from different parts of the country, all eager to hear from the neighborhood rebels who had taken on the HOA and won the hearts of the public. It was surreal. I had expected resistance from the HOA, but I hadn't expected to get this much support from others. Our movement wasn't just about painting houses. It had become a symbol of the fight against arbitrary authority, of reclaiming individuality, and of standing up for what was right. The media coverage was constant. Local blogs wrote about us. Online forums lit up with discussions about HOA overreach. The hashtag #ColorOurHomes was used to share personal stories, pictures of colorful homes, and even petitions to reform HOA laws. What started as a small, personal battle had turned into a national conversation. But, as expected, the HOA was not about to let this go quietly. They tried to discredit us at every turn. They claimed that our actions were disruptive, that we were damaging the integrity of the neighborhood, and that we had violated the very essence of the community they had worked so hard to build. One day I received another letter from the HOA. This one was different. It was official, written by their lawyer. The tone was harsh, threatening, and full of legal jargon. The letter demanded that we immediately restore our homes to their original colors or face legal consequences. They also threatened to fine each homeowner up to $5,000 per day until the homes were returned to the approved color scheme. Dear residents, we have reviewed your actions and would like to remind you that the community guidelines, which were agreed upon when you purchased your homes, clearly state that no exterior modifications, including paint color, can be made without prior approval. Your actions are not only a violation of these guidelines, but are causing significant disruption to the community's aesthetics. We demand that all homes be returned to their original state by the end of this month. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including but not limited to hefty fines and lawsuits. We urge you to reconsider your actions. Sincerely, the Homeowners Association legal team. I stared at the letter in disbelief. $5,000 per day. This was escalating quickly, but instead of feeling fear, something else surged within me: anger, determination, and a deep resolve. The HOA had underestimated us. We weren't just a neighborhood anymore. We were a movement, and we weren't going to back down. I called Karen, Alex, and the others immediately. We have to stand firm. We can't let them win. We've come this far, and we're not going to stop now. We've got your back, Karen said, her voice steady. Let's fight this, together. And that was when I realized this wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about a few colorful houses. This was about all of us standing together, fighting for our right to live freely, to express ourselves, and to take back control of our own homes. The HOA might have thought they could scare us into submission. But they were wrong. The fight was just beginning. The letter from the HOA was like a slap in the face. A reminder that they weren't just going to let us get away with defying them. The threat of $5,000 fines per day was enough to make anyone pause. But not me. Not now. We had already come too far, and I wasn't about to let them take away the momentum we had worked so hard to build. The following day, I met with the group of neighbors who had stood by me from the beginning. We gathered in Karen's living room, the air thick with anxiety and determination. No one spoke at first. Everyone was digesting the severity of the HOA's legal threat, but we all knew what had to be done. Do we really want to give up now? I asked, breaking the silence. My voice wasn't as strong as I would have liked, but there was a fire in my heart that refused to be extinguished. I don't know about you, Karen said, her voice steady, but I'm not going to let them bully us into compliance. This isn't just about paint. It's about our rights. Alex nodded in agreement. They're trying to intimidate us into backing down. But if we give in now, what happens next? What other rights will they try to take away? That question hung in the air, a stark reminder of what was at stake. It wasn't just about fighting for our homes anymore. It was about fighting for our right to live how we wanted, to express ourselves without fear of punishment. If we gave in, it would be the first of many steps backward. We have a chance to make a stand here, I said, feeling the weight of the moment. But we need to think carefully about our next move. We need a strategy to push back. I could feel the collective determination in the room. We weren't going to back down, not without a fight. But we needed to make sure our next steps were well thought out, calculated, and unshakable. That's when Karen suggested we fight the HOA legally. If they want to take this to court, then let's do it. We can't let them scare us into repainting our homes. We can use their own tactics against them. Maybe we can even challenge some of the outdated HOA laws in the process. It was a bold idea, but it made sense. If the HOA was serious about taking us to court, we needed to be just as serious in our defense. We would hire a lawyer, build a case, and fight for our rights, not just for our own homes, but for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed by HOA rules. The next few days were a blur. We met with a lawyer who specialized in property rights, HOA disputes, and local government regulations. The lawyer was sympathetic to our cause and had seen similar cases in the past. The HOA is trying to use fear and intimidation to control you, he told us. But the law is on your side. You have every right to challenge their demands, and if they want to take this to court, they'll have to prove their case. The lawyer helped us file a petition to stop the HOA's legal actions, and we began preparing for the upcoming battle. It wasn't just about defending our homes anymore. It was about challenging the very system that allowed HOAs to have so much control over our lives. Meanwhile, the media kept pushing our story. The hashtag #color our homes continued to spread like wildfire, and more homeowners across the country began sharing their own struggles with HOA overreach. What had started as a small neighborhood dispute had become a movement. People were rallying behind us, offering their support, and signing petitions to change HOA laws. But the HOA wasn't backing down either. They doubled down, hiring a high-powered lawyer to take us on. They had the resources, the money, and the power, and they weren't afraid to use them. The letters kept coming. More threats, more fines, more intimidation. But we didn't flinch. As the date of our court hearing approached, the tension was unbearable. Every time I walked down the street, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me. They were all watching, waiting, hoping that we could win this fight. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. We had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt powerless against an authority they couldn't control. The morning of the court hearing arrived, and I could barely breathe. The thought of facing off against the HOA in a courtroom was nerve-wracking, but I knew we couldn't back down now. I arrived at the courthouse early, along with Karen, Alex, and the others. Our lawyer met us at the entrance and led us into the courtroom, where the HOA's representatives were already seated. They looked smug, as if they knew they had the upper hand, but I wasn't so sure anymore. We sat down, our hearts pounding, as the judge called the court to order. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel the weight of the moment on my shoulders. The first few minutes of the hearing were filled with legal jargon and formalities, but then it was time for our lawyer to speak. Our position is simple, the lawyer began, standing up. The HOA has overstepped its bounds. The residents of this neighborhood have the right to express themselves, to personalize their homes as they see fit. The HOA's rules are outdated and oppressive, and we believe they violate the constitutional rights of the homeowners. I could feel a wave of hope wash over me. This wasn't just a fight for my home anymore. This was a fight for all of us. The HOA's lawyer stood up to counter. "Your Honor," he said, "the rules of the HOA exist to maintain property values and community harmony. These actions by the defendants not only undermine those goals, but they create a dangerous precedent for homeowners disregarding the agreed-upon community standards." But our lawyer wasn't intimidated. The HOA's restrictions have become a straitjacket on homeowners, stifling their creativity and expression. These rules no longer serve the community. They serve the HOA's need for control. And that's something the court needs to address. The battle was on, and it was just beginning. The courtroom was silent as the judge listened intently to both sides. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. The HOA's lawyer was doing his best to sway the court, using every piece of legal jargon in his arsenal, while our lawyer remained calm, focused, and unwavering. I sat in the front row, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't help but glance at Karen, Alex, and the others. Their faces were a mix of determination and anxiety, but I knew one thing for sure. We were in this together, and no matter how it turned out, we had already made an impact. We had already proven that the HOA didn't have the absolute power they once believed they had. The HOA lawyer's argument was predictable. He emphasized the community guidelines, the supposed need for uniformity, and the dangers of setting a precedent that allowed homeowners to make whatever changes they wanted without approval. He painted a picture of chaos, of anarchy, where homes would look like a patchwork quilt, if homeowners were allowed to paint their houses any color they chose. But our lawyer wasn't having it. "Your Honor," he said, standing tall, his voice clear and strong, "the HOA's rules, which may have once been intended to maintain order, are no longer justifiable. They are outdated, and more importantly, they are infringing on the basic rights of homeowners. We are not asking to destroy the harmony of the community. We are asking for the right to express ourselves, to personalize our homes, and to live without the constant overreach of a governing body that has lost sight of its true purpose." The judge nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pen on the desk as he absorbed both arguments. It was clear he was taking everything into account. There was no rush, no hurry to make a decision. But every word our lawyer spoke seemed to chip away at the HOA's case. As the hearing continued, the judge called for a recess. My nerves were shot. The waiting was unbearable, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. I stepped outside the courtroom for some air, trying to calm my thoughts. But as I stood there, I saw something that made my heart swell. A small crowd of people gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Fight for freedom," "Color our homes," and "Say no to HOA overreach." They were here to support us, and I knew we weren't alone in this fight. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge called us back to order, and the final statements were made. Our lawyer made a compelling closing argument, emphasizing the positive impact of our actions, not just for us, but for everyone who felt oppressed by restrictive HOA rules. He spoke about how our fight had sparked a movement, how it had gotten people to think about the balance between personal rights and community guidelines. The HOA lawyer, meanwhile, stuck to his script, reiterating the dangers of allowing homeowners to ignore the guidelines. The judge paused, looking at the papers in front of him, his face neutral. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he lifted his head and spoke. "I have heard the arguments from both sides. It is clear that this case raises important questions about the role and limits of homeowners associations. It is also clear that this issue is more than just about the color of a house. It is about the balance of power, the rights of homeowners, and the fairness of regulations that govern our communities." My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The decision was coming. The court recognizes the need for communities to maintain certain standards, but it also recognizes the rights of homeowners to make choices about their property within reasonable limits. While the HOA does have a role to play in maintaining property values and community aesthetics, those guidelines must not infringe upon the basic rights of the homeowners. The judge paused again, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The room was completely still. "Therefore," the judge continued, his voice steady, "the court rules in favor of the defendants. The HOA's demands to repaint the homes in question will be lifted, and the fines will be dismissed. Additionally, this court will review the HOA's guidelines to ensure they are in line with the rights of homeowners and are not overly restrictive." A wave of relief washed over me, and I could barely believe it. We had won. The judge's decision wasn't just a personal victory for us. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed by an HOA. We had proven that the power of the people could overcome even the most entrenched systems of control. As the courtroom emptied, I looked at my neighbors, Karen, Alex, and the others. We were all smiling, shaking our heads in disbelief. We had done it. We had fought for our rights, and we had won. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters erupted in applause when they heard the news. The Number Color Our Homes movement had grown stronger than ever, and now it had a real victory to back it up. The media quickly picked up the story, and soon We were being interviewed by reporters who wanted to hear how it felt to stand up to the HOA and win. But the victory didn't just belong to us, it belonged to everyone who had supported us, who had shared their own stories of HOA overreach, who had rallied behind the idea of reclaiming personal freedom. The movement had only just begun. The victory was sweeter than I had ever imagined, but, as with any battle, the aftermath was complicated. The court's ruling was a huge win for us, but it also sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Not everyone was thrilled with how things had played out. While many homeowners rejoiced, some of the more conservative residents were less than pleased with the changes we had set in motion. The day after the ruling, I walked down the street, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. I could see the subtle changes in the neighborhood, the vibrant colors now gleaming on homes, the once muted streets now full of personality. It was a new era, one where homeowners were no longer afraid to express themselves, to take control of their properties, and to live without the looming threat of the HOA's overreach. But not all the changes were easy. As I walked past one of the houses, I saw Mr. Stevenson, an elderly neighbor, standing on his porch. He looked at me with a mixture of disapproval and confusion, shaking his head slowly. "I don't know what you've done to this neighborhood, but it's not the same anymore," he muttered, before turning back inside. It stung. Mr. Stevenson wasn't the first person to voice such concerns, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. Some people still didn't understand what we had fought for, and they never would. To them, the HOA's guidelines were a necessary evil, the glue that held the community together. They didn't see it as overreach or an infringement on personal rights. They saw it as the price of living in a well-maintained neighborhood. But then there were the others, the ones who approached me with smiles, handshakes, and gratitude, the ones who felt liberated by our victory, who were glad to see the rules finally starting to change. They were the ones who saw the bigger picture, the ones who understood that this was about more than just a paint color. It was about reclaiming autonomy over our lives, about standing up against systems that tried to control us in ways that didn't make sense. Karen, Alex, and I sat down a few days later at the local cafe, sipping coffee and reflecting on everything that had happened. The press coverage had died down a bit, but the movement was far from over. People were still talking about our case, still rallying behind the idea of challenging outdated HOA rules. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. "We did something amazing," Karen said, leaning back in her chair. "But I think it's just the beginning. We need to keep pushing for change, for more rights for homeowners." I agreed. This isn't over. There are still HOAs across the country that are abusing their power. We need to make sure this victory doesn't go to waste. Alex nodded. "We've started something here. Maybe it's time to turn it into something bigger. Maybe we start a national movement, something to challenge not just one HOA, but the whole system." I smiled. The idea had merit. This wasn't just about a small victory in one neighborhood. It was about creating real, lasting change that could spread to communities everywhere. If we could push back against the system here, we could do it elsewhere. And so, with the success of our court case as a foundation, we decided to take action. We formed an official group, a coalition of homeowners who had fought back against their HOAs, who believed in the power of self-expression, and who were committed to creating a nationwide movement. We called it the Homeowner Rights Coalition, and our mission was simple: to challenge outdated HOA laws and create a more balanced approach to community governance. We started by organizing rallies, hosting town hall meetings, and speaking with legislators about reforming HOA laws. Our cause gained traction quickly as more and more homeowners reached out to us, sharing their stories of HOA overreach and oppression. The media, which had already covered our case extensively, began to pick up the story of our growing movement. People from across the country began to see that this fight wasn't just about one neighborhood. It was about empowering homeowners everywhere. The HOA, meanwhile, wasn't done with us. They appealed the court's decision, hoping to reverse the ruling and restore their grip on our neighborhood. But we were ready. We fought back with even more determination, rallying support from homeowners across the country, from legal experts who believed in our cause, and from the public who were finally starting to see the dangers of unchecked HOA power. The appeal process took months, but each day brought more people into the fold, more stories of resistance, more demands for change. The momentum we had started was growing exponentially, and we were no longer fighting alone. This was no longer just about me or my neighbors. This was a fight for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the demands of a governing body that didn't have their best interests at heart. In the end, we didn't just win one battle, we sparked a revolution. A movement that would continue long after our personal fight was over. One afternoon, I stood outside my house, looking at the bright colors we had chosen for the walls. It wasn't just about the paint anymore. It was about the freedom to live as we saw fit, the freedom to express ourselves, to take control of our lives, and to fight for what we believed in. The HOA could try to control us, to intimidate us, but they would never break our spirit. We had shown that together we could stand up to any challenge, and we would continue to fight for our rights. And this was only the beginning. The aftermath of our court victory was more than I had ever anticipated. What had started as a small, local dispute over a paint color had now become the spark for something much larger. The Homeowner Rights Coalition, HRC, was growing, and with it, the weight of our movement. What we had done in our neighborhood, what we had fought for, was resonating with thousands of people across the country. It felt like the fight had transcended our personal struggle, and it was now a battle for homeowners everywhere. It was surreal to see the progress. I had always thought of myself as a regular person, just trying to do right by my family, by my neighbors. But now I was standing at the forefront of a revolution. At first, we just focused on gathering stories, people reaching out to us, sharing their experiences with oppressive HOAs, their struggles with arbitrary rules, and the constant battles over property rights. The number of stories that poured in was staggering. Each letter, each email, each phone call reinforced the idea that we were not alone. Our fight was not isolated. It was part of a larger, systemic issue that needed addressing. Soon, Karen, Alex, and I found ourselves in meetings with lawmakers, trying to convince them that HOA reform was necessary. We met with local and state legislators, speaking passionately about our cause, about how homeowners were being treated like tenants in their own homes. We pushed for more stringent regulations on HOAs, demanding more oversight and accountability. It wasn't just about dismantling the system. It was about making it work for homeowners, not against them. We need to put the power back in the hands of the people, I told a state senator one afternoon. Homeowners should have the freedom to choose how they want to live in their own homes. It's that simple. The senator listened intently, and after some back and forth, he agreed to sponsor a bill that would require all HOAs to have more transparency and accountability in their decisions. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. We had taken a bold first step in the battle, and now we were building momentum. As the months passed, our movement gained even more traction. National media outlets picked up our story, and we were featured in interviews on television and in online publications. Our coalition had grown to include homeowners from all over the country, and the support was overwhelming. We held rallies, marched in front of state capitals, and made our voices heard. Our movement wasn't just about the paint color on a house anymore. It was about reclaiming control over our own lives, our own homes, and our own futures. But with this newfound attention came the pushback. The HOA industry wasn't about to let their power slip away quietly. They fought back with everything they had, hiring lobbyists to block any attempts at legislative reform. They spread misinformation about our movement, claiming that we were trying to create chaos in communities, that we were threatening property values, and that we didn't care about the greater good. They accused us of being troublemakers, of wanting to destroy the very thing that kept neighborhoods safe and beautiful. They painted us as radical extremists who just wanted to tear down the structures of society. It was frustrating, but I knew what we were doing was right. I had lived it. We had lived it. We knew the consequences of unchecked HOA power. And we knew that what we were fighting for wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It was about freedom. It was about people being able to live their lives without fear of unjust punishment for something as simple as painting their house the wrong color. During one particularly intense media interview, the reporter asked me, "Do you think that HOAs have a place in society? Should they exist at all?" I paused for a moment, thinking carefully. "I think HOAs have the potential to be helpful," I said. "They can be beneficial when they're used for the right reasons, to maintain community standards and protect property values. But when they overstep their bounds, when they start dictating every aspect of how people live, that's when they become harmful. And that's what we've seen. HOAs out of control, using fear to control people's lives. Our movement isn't about abolishing HOAs. It's about putting limits on them, making sure they work for the people, not against them." The reporter nodded, and the interview ended. But the question lingered in my mind. Did HOAs have a place in society? Could they be reformed, or were they inherently flawed? I wasn't sure, but I knew this. People had the right to decide for themselves, and that's what our movement was really about: choice, freedom, and control over our own lives. A few weeks later, we found ourselves preparing for the biggest rally yet. This wasn't just about our neighborhood anymore. This was about sending a message to the world. We had organized a march in Washington, D.C. to demand national attention for HOA reform. We invited homeowners, activists, and legislators to join us in the heart of the nation's capital to make our voices heard. The day of the rally, the streets were packed with people wearing Number Color Our Homes shirts, holding signs that read, "Our homes, our rules," and "Freedom for homeowners." The energy was electric. It was like we were witnessing history being made, one step at a time. People from every corner of the country had come to stand with us, united in the belief that change was not only possible, but necessary. Karen, Alex, and I stood together at the front of the rally, looking out at the sea of faces. It was overwhelming, humbling, and beautiful. I had never imagined that something so simple, something as small as a paint color, could spark a nationwide movement. But here we were, fighting for our rights, fighting for the rights of every homeowner who had ever been silenced by an HOA. As the march continued, I realized that this was no longer just about the victory we had won in our neighborhood. This was about something much bigger, a fight for the freedom to live without fear, the freedom to be who we were meant to be, and the freedom to shape our own futures. And as the marchers chanted, "Homes not prisons, freedom not rules," I knew that this was only the beginning. The rally in Washington, D.C. was a turning point. The media coverage was unlike anything we had experienced before. Our message spread across the nation, and soon we were being invited to speak at conferences, forums, and interviews all around the country. The Homeowner Rights Coalition, HRC, had become more than just a local movement. It was a national cause. The surge in attention also brought in new allies. Lawmakers, community leaders, and even celebrities who had once been silent on the issue began to speak out in support of our movement. It was clear that the momentum was building, but with that momentum came even more fierce opposition from the HOA lobbyists, who had mobilized all their resources to protect their interests. A few weeks after the rally, we received word that a major bill, one that would begin to overhaul HOA regulations nationwide, was being debated in Congress. It was a pivotal moment. This bill had the potential to change the way HOAs operated, to put real limits on their power and give homeowners more rights. The excitement in the coalition was palpable. We had worked so hard to get to this point, and now we were finally on the brink of something that could alter the course of history. But as we celebrated our victories, I knew that we had to remain cautious. This was far from over. The fight was far from won. The HOA lobby, seeing their grip slipping, was pulling out all the stops. They launched an aggressive ad campaign, flooding the media with negative ads that painted us as radicals, as anarchists, threatening the very fabric of American communities. They argued that if the bill passed, it would lead to chaos. Neighborhoods would fall apart, property values would plummet, and people would stop caring about community standards. The fear-mongering was intense, and the message was clear. If we succeeded, it would be disastrous for everyone. The media picked up on these claims, and soon we found ourselves facing an uphill battle. The narrative shifted from a fight for homeowners' rights to a fear-driven campaign about the dangers of change. Even some of the people who had supported us in the past began to waver, unsure about the consequences of such sweeping reforms. It was a moment of uncertainty. Could we win this fight? Could we hold the line against such powerful opposition? I turned to Karen and Alex for guidance. We sat together late one night, strategizing, trying to figure out how we could respond to the increasing fear and doubt. "I think we need to go back to basics," Karen said, her voice steady. "We need to remind people why we started this movement in the first place. This isn't just about paint colors or small changes. This is about freedom, about the right to live in our homes without being controlled by an organization that doesn't have our best interests at heart." Alex nodded in agreement. "We need to shift the narrative. We've been so focused on the legal battles and the media war. Maybe it's time to go back to the human stories, the real people who have been affected by the overreach of HOAs. Those are the stories that will resonate the most." I thought about their words. They were right. The media frenzy, the political back and forth, it was all important. But at the heart of this fight were real people. People like Mr. Stevenson, who had been forced to remove the garden he'd spent years cultivating, or the young couple who had been fined for putting up a flag in support of their military service. These were the faces that needed to be shown. These were the stories that could change minds. The next few weeks were a blur. We launched a new campaign focusing on real personal stories from homeowners who had suffered at the hands of their HOAs. We reached out to journalists and news outlets, offering them first-hand accounts of the devastation caused by overzealous HOAs. We used social media to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced by the system. And slowly, the tide began to turn. As the bill moved through Congress, we organized more rallies and events to remind people of the human cost of the HOA system. We pushed back against the fear-mongering, showing that the real danger was not the reforms we were advocating for, but the unchecked power that HOAs had been wielding for decades. And then one morning, we received the news we had been waiting for. The bill had passed. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a huge step forward. The bill included provisions for greater oversight of HOAs, stricter regulations on their power, and safeguards to protect homeowners from unnecessary fines and penalties. It also provided a framework for homeowners to challenge unfair rules and seek legal recourse without the burden of astronomical legal fees. The victory wasn't just ours. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever been oppressed by their HOA. It was a victory for freedom, for choice, for the right to live in your own home without fear of arbitrary punishment. But as we celebrated, I couldn't help but think about the future. This was just the beginning. We had won the battle, but the war was far from over. There were still communities across the country that needed change. There were still countless homeowners who were living under the thumb of oppressive HOA rules. Our fight wasn't over, and with that thought, I made a promise to myself. The movement would continue. We would continue to fight for the rights of homeowners, to push for even more reforms, to ensure that no one would ever again be bullied into submission by a faceless organization that didn't have their best interests at heart. As I stood in the middle of a crowded rally, the cheers of my neighbors and supporters ringing in my ears, I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The victory felt surreal. For so long, we had been in the trenches, fighting for something that seemed so simple, a right to live in our homes without fear of oppressive rules and fines. Now, we had achieved something that seemed impossible just a few months ago. Real change, nationwide attention, and the beginning of a new chapter for homeowners everywhere. But as we celebrated, there was an unexpected sense of unease that began to creep into my thoughts. The reality of the victory had yet to fully sink in. And while the reform bill was a huge step forward, it wasn't a cure-all. As the days passed, we began to notice some troubling signs of backlash, things that we hadn't anticipated when we first started this fight. The first signs came from the HOA industry itself. They weren't simply going to roll over and accept defeat. The more we spoke about the success of the reform bill, the louder the resistance grew. It was no longer about simple ad campaigns or lobbying. The industry was now taking a more strategic approach. The largest and most powerful HOAs in the country began to organize. They pooled their resources to form a new national association that would work to push back against the reforms. Their message was simple. The bill was too restrictive, too damaging to community values, and too costly for homeowners. They painted the reforms as a threat to neighborhood safety, arguing that the lack of strict regulations would lead to chaos in residential areas. What worried me the most wasn't their ad campaigns or their polished talking points. It was the growing sense of division within communities. While the bill had passed, it didn't mean that all HOAs would immediately fall in line. Many continued to resist, We began to hear stories of HOAs implementing even more arbitrary rules in a last-ditch effort to maintain control. They started charging higher fines for trivial violations, knowing that homeowners were now more likely to challenge them. Some communities were even seeing increased surveillance of residents, as HOAs tried to monitor every move to avoid breaking the new regulations. The promises of the bill were still fresh, but the struggle wasn't over. Communities were divided. Some HOAs grudgingly accepted the new regulations, while others tried to exploit loopholes to maintain their power. It was a frustrating realization that our fight wasn't done, and we needed to continue pushing for change. At the same time, the bill's passage had stirred something in the people, a sense of empowerment. Homeowners were no longer afraid to speak out. As we held town hall meetings and offered resources to those still fighting for their rights, more and more people were stepping up to challenge their HOAs. It was a powerful wave of action, but it also came with complications. With so many people newly emboldened, there was a rising tide of bitterness and anger toward HOAs. Some of these conflicts were beginning to spiral out of control, with lawsuits and disputes becoming more frequent and, at times, uglier. We were no longer just fighting for fair treatment. We were fighting for control over how people engaged with their own communities. The emotional toll of this fight was mounting, and I found myself questioning the path forward. Would this reform create a more balanced system, or were we inadvertently creating a new set of problems by challenging the very system we had sought to improve? I had a conversation with Alex one evening, and I voiced my concerns. What if we've unleashed something we can't control? I asked, feeling the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. What if the reforms we fought for end up making things worse? Alex leaned back, considering my words. I get it. It's scary. But you can't fix a broken system by keeping it in place. Sure, there will be some bumps along the way. Change is always messy. But the fact that homeowners are standing up, challenging the system, that's a win. The old way wasn't working. People were suffering under the weight of these HOAs. Now, they're at least being heard. His words made sense, but the doubt still lingered. For every homeowner who was empowered, there was another caught in a battle they weren't prepared to fight. For every victory, there seemed to be a new challenge waiting just around the corner. To make matters worse, the national media began to shift their focus once again. No longer was our victory portrayed as a triumph for homeowner rights. Instead, the media was now highlighting the growing conflicts within communities, the increasing number of lawsuits, and the rise in tension between residents and HOAs. What had once been seen as a fight for freedom was now being painted as a source of chaos and disorder. The narrative had shifted, and the very reforms we had fought for were starting to be blamed for the fallout. One evening, I received a phone call from Karen, her voice tight with frustration. "Have you seen the news?" she asked. "They're calling this whole movement a disaster. They're saying that people are using the new laws as an excuse to attack their neighbors. They're turning us into villains." I sighed, rubbing my temples. I know, it's infuriating, but we can't back down now. We can't let them twist our message. We did this for the right reasons. People need to know that. It's just, I don't know, Karen said. I thought the victory would feel different, but now it's like we've opened a Pandora's box. I'm not sure we're ready for everything that's happening. We spent the next few hours talking, trying to figure out how to keep the momentum going without losing the essence of what we had fought for. It became clear to us that we needed to take a step back and reassess. We couldn't just push forward blindly, hoping everything would work itself out. We needed a plan, one that would help us navigate the unintended consequences of the reforms and keep the movement grounded in the principles that had sparked it in the first place. The next day, I called Alex and Karen into a meeting. We had to regroup, refocus, and figure out a way to keep the movement strong without losing sight of the values we had started with: fairness, freedom, and the right for homeowners to have a voice in their own homes. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: we couldn't give up. Not now, not when we had come this far. It was time to dig in, to continue fighting, and to make sure that the changes we had fought for would truly make a difference in the long run. The world had changed, but not in the way we had expected. While we had fought for fairness and justice, what we had ultimately ignited was a nationwide debate about control, freedom, and the future of neighborhoods. It was clear that even with the reform bill passed, the path forward would not be smooth. The unintended consequences were piling up, and we were beginning to see the toll it was taking on communities across the country. The HOA industry had dug in its heels, and despite the new regulations, many had found ways to exploit loopholes or simply ignore the changes. As we continued to monitor the situation, it became evident that the battle for homeowners' rights was far from over. In some ways, it had just begun. As a coalition, we were faced with a tough decision. How could we continue pushing for the change we had worked so hard to achieve without causing further division and turmoil? We had to find a way to hold on to the spirit of the reform: fairness, transparency, and respect for individual rights, while also addressing the growing frustrations from homeowners who felt caught in the middle of the conflict. I found myself increasingly torn between two opposing forces. On one side were the idealists, the ones who had started this movement with the hope that it would bring about true change, a better future for everyone. On the other side were the realists, those who saw the cracks in the system and warned that we needed to proceed cautiously, with an understanding of the complexities involved. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the reforms we had fought for were only the first step. We had opened the door, but now we needed to push through it, carefully and strategically, to make sure the changes stuck. I reached out to Karen and Alex again. It was clear that we needed a more nuanced approach, a plan to address the unintended consequences and ensure the reforms didn't spiral out of control. We can't just keep pushing the same message, I said to them one evening. The world is more complicated now. We need to figure out how to make this work for everyone, not just homeowners, but also the communities, the families, and the people who feel like they've lost control. Karen nodded slowly. I think you're right. Maybe what we need is a more inclusive approach, something that emphasizes not just homeowner rights, but also community engagement. We can't let this turn into a war between residents and their HOAs. If we want real change, we need to focus on building bridges, not just burning down the system. Alex agreed. Maybe it's time to bring people together: homeowners, HOA representatives, lawmakers, everyone who has a stake in this. We can't expect change if we're all shouting at each other from opposite sides. If we can show them that there's a middle ground, we might be able to create something that works for everyone. It was a moment of clarity. We had been so focused on fighting against the system that we had forgotten to consider the people who were part of it, the ones who were simply trying to maintain a sense of community and order. Our mission had never been about destroying neighborhoods. It was about giving people a fair chance to live freely, without the heavy-handed rules that had governed their lives for so long. Now, we needed to find a way to bring those two worlds together. We decided to launch a new initiative, the Homeowner Collaboration Project. It would be a series of town halls, workshops, and forums designed to bring together homeowners, HOA leaders, and local lawmakers to discuss the future of neighborhoods. The goal was not just to advocate for homeowners, but to create a dialogue where everyone could voice their concerns, propose solutions, and find common ground. It wasn't going to be easy. The wounds of the past few months were still fresh, and the anger between homeowners and HOAs was palpable. But we knew that if we could get people to listen to each other, to understand the other side's perspective, we might be able to find a solution that worked for everyone. The first meeting was held in a community center in a small town where tensions were high and the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. On one side of the room, homeowners who had suffered under their HOAs sat with arms crossed, while on the other, HOA representatives, some of whom had lobbied against the reforms, glared at us with frustration. I stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of the moment. This was our chance to change the conversation. This was our opportunity to create something positive out of the chaos. We're not here to tear anyone down, I began, my voice steady. We're here to listen, to hear the stories, the struggles, the challenges that every person in this room has faced. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing: to live in a community where we feel safe, respected, and free to make our own choices. There was silence for a moment, then a few hesitant nods. The first breakthrough had been made. Over the next few hours, the room slowly began to open up. Homeowners shared their stories, telling of how their lives had been disrupted by unreasonable fines, arbitrary rules, and the feeling that they had no say in their own homes. HOA representatives, initially defensive, began to listen, realizing that many of the complaints were rooted in misunderstandings or outdated practices. We discussed solutions, things like better communication between HOAs and homeowners, more transparency in decision-making, and systems for resolving disputes without resorting to fines or legal battles. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The Homeowner Collaboration Project continued to grow, with more and more communities adopting the idea of dialogue and cooperation. It wasn't an overnight fix, and there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt that we were on the right path. The fight was far from over, but we had learned a valuable lesson. The road to change was not a straight line. It was a winding, messy journey that required patience, empathy, and the willingness to listen. And if we kept pushing forward together, there was no limit to what we could achieve.